The UFO people used to make it look like it's the same experience time and time again, and the implication would be that scientists from another planet have come and are studying us. But when you read the actual testimony, forget it. I mean, whatever's happening, it's not that. There's a theme underlying this, which is a question about what the world actually is and what we are, more than it is a question about whether or not aliens are here. I don't think that's really answerable at the present time. I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about that or not. I don't really care. I haven't signed anything. So some of the biological remains are incomplete in the sense that they look like bodies that weren't finished. So you figure that out.
Chris Lehto, welcome to LehtoFiles.
Hey, welcome. I have a very exciting show today on LehtoFiles with author Whitley Strieber. And I have his book. My wife was actually very excited when I told her that I had an interview with you, Whitley. And she read your book, Communion, and I actually just finished Them. I read it on Kindle's digital version of Them, and really amazing book. And so I'm so happy to have you on the show. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it, Chris. I'm excited. We've never done this before, and it's always fun for the first time with a podcaster, and especially one with a really good podcast. I have to tell you, I watch and listen to it, so I know where I am. Help.
Well, excellent. And I enjoy your podcast as well. I mentioned the books just there, but I do. I watch at least once a month. I catch it. I catch Richard Dolan. I watch his once in a while, and then whenever yours comes up on my feed, I think maybe when you have a more popular video or something comes up on my YouTube feed. And so, very interesting channel as well. So, great. Thanks again for being on the show. So, I've read Them, and if anyone is aware of your books, you've been a very prolific fiction writer, actually. And is it mostly horror books or all horror books?
No, I haven't done any fiction in a long time. The last fiction book I did was called New, and it's about a group of beings who live in Indonesia who are actually as smart as human beings, but they're very small, and they're called Tanda. And it turns out recently, the strangest thing is they think they actually do exist. There's been some indications in Indonesia that the species actually exists. How intelligent they are, but we don't know, but they may exist. Anyway, that was my last fiction. And then before that, goodness, I did The Wolf and the Hunger, many books of fiction and sort of hybrid fiction like Superstorm and War Day, which Superstorm was written with Art Bell, and War Day was written with a science writer, Jim Konetka, who was a childhood friend and still is a friend. And so I've been kind of all over the lot. It's not all horror fiction.
Okay, and then after Communion, I'm assuming that's your first main UAP or phenomena-related book?
Yeah, Communion was a big surprise. I mean, the first surprise was that this happened, and then the second surprise, equally large or larger, was when I published the book, and there was this incredible cultural explosion beyond anything I had thought would happen, and certainly beyond what the publisher thought. No one thought. When we wrote Communion, I wrote it largely because it was such an interesting experience and so unusual and so hard to pin down. The book doesn't say it's about alien contact. The book says it's basically a series of questions about what in the world did happen, because something did happen. I was injured physically, but what? And I wasn't in any mental space to expect it would be aliens, if it even was aliens. I still don't know the answer to that question. But then it was published, and the face on the cover caused an amazing reaction in the public all over the world. When people saw that face, Yeah, you're looking at it now. Watch out, folks.
Hmm.
Anyway, when they saw that face, they thought, my God, it wasn't a dream. And we ended up with, oh my God, we must have gotten easily 500,000 letters over the next 4 or 5 years. And my wife, who you can see in the background, fortunately and very presciently saved most all of the letters that had a complex story in them. And they are now archived at Rice University, something called the Archives of the Impossible that was started by my friend and co-author in the book Supernatural, Jeffrey Kripal. So they're there and they're saved, and I'm very glad of that. I'm looking for funding to digitize them. If anyone is interested in doing that, let me know.
That's at Rice University, yes?
At Rice University, yeah.
In Houston?
In Houston, yes.
And excellent. And that's really what them focused on, right? Was just some key letters that you received
Yes.
after this communion. So out of these, however many hundreds of thousands of letters, your wife screened many of them or most of them. And
Oh, she read it. When
so
they
your
first
wife
started,
screened all of those. Yeah.
yeah, when they first started coming in, the mailman started to appear at our apartment door with these huge boxes full of letters and just pour them out on the living room floor. And they were like a huge pile, and they all had addresses on them and personal stories inside. And I was saying to Anne, what are we going to do? We can't just throw them out, and no one can read this mass of letters. And she said, oh, no, that's not true. I can. I'll buy a letter opener. And she did. And she hired a secretary. And they read those letters, all of them, and typed up about a third of them with the ones that of the full descriptions. And I think there must be around 10,000 letters at Rice, maybe more.
Wow.
So
10,000 there. So that's so boiled down to 10,000. And then out of 10,000, you selected several for them. Not, I don't remember
yes, I
exact number, but
selected, I wouldn't call it a representative sample. I would call it a useful sample in that these were letters that could be analyzed in interesting ways, and letters that had each one of them. There is with one exception, there are multiple witnesses or events that occurred in the context of the experience that suggest that it's not simply dreamed up or a complete misapprehension of an ordinary experience. So that
was
was the
amazed too
criteria.
by the variety of so many different types of experiences.
Oh yeah,
Even in just in them, I can imagine that if you span it out.
expand it out, you find very quickly that the idea that this is the UFO people used to make it look like it's the same experience time and time again, and the implication would be that scientists from another planet have come and are studying us. But when you read the actual testimony, that forget it. I mean, whatever's happening, it's not that. Or if it
Yeah,
is
they're
that,
just ridiculous. Yeah. There's a
yeah,
trickster element. I don't know. Yeah, weird elements. Yeah.
well, there are a lot of elements in there. There's a thematic theme underlying this, which is a question about what the world actually is and what we are, more than it is a question about whether or not aliens are here. I don't think that's really answerable at the present time. Uh, I mean, God knows what kind of answers there are in the inner circles of the government. I've met many of the people who work on this, and they don't know. Uh, they do have apparently some biological remains, but even that is a question because I don't know if I'm supposed to talk about that or not. Well, I don't really care. I haven't signed anything. So some of the biological remains are incomplete in the sense that they look like bodies that weren't finished. So you figure that out.
Hmm.
I don't know what to make of it.
Not fully printed,
Exactly.
fully baked.
Things with esophaguses that just peter out and stuff, and kidney, liver combination organs that can't work. stuff like that. So I hear. It's just rumors.
What I was just editing a video from the Congress people after the 12 January meeting, and the classified briefing with the House Oversight Committee and with the ICIG, and Representative Luna, she said that Grush will not call it alien. He'll only, or extraterrestrial. He refers to it as interdimensional, and that's what she thought was interesting. She wants to try and track down what does that mean, interdimensional. He's very particular about that. Is that kind of what you're referencing, maybe?
I don't think that means anything. It's just a word like that's used by people who don't really know what it means. Like people always are using the word quantum in order to say they really mean mysterious. Quantum simply means the smallest possible measure. And there's nothing mysterious about that, except when you try to look at it, of course. But
discrete, I guess discrete quanta is
exactly
what I think of.
The difficulty with quanta is the discrete part, because
Yes.
it either is discrete or isn't discrete, depending on who's peeking at it, which has always been a fascinating mystery. But with regard to this interdimensionality thing, what would it mean? What would it actually mean? In other words, we can postulate and write equations that show that there might very well be many different worlds, the many worlds theory, and all sorts of things like that, that on a physical level, if you think about them, seem extremely improbable. But then again, this universe itself seems extremely improbable too. So that maybe that's no bar to the possibility of it being real. To me, when they say interdimensional, what they're really saying is this doesn't make sense to us. And David Grush probably knows a considerable amount about the bodies. And therefore, he knows they don't make sense to us. And that would be why he said, well, it must be interdimensional because it doesn't make sense in this dimension.
I do have a speculation about that, the interdimensional. Maybe I can run it by you.
Yeah, please do.
I have a separate theme on my channel of theories where I look into the universe and the cosmos and the nature of reality, etc. And so I postulated that it could be what we're seeing when we look up in the cosmos is actually macroscopic life. Just as we're looking down and we learned about microscopic life. Back in the day, and they thought they didn't know what colds were, and they made up these stories or these mythical things or ghosts, right? Whatever it was, spirits that passed around that caused effects in humans. And then we invented this new technology, the lens, and then they used it for microscopes and telescopes at the same time, right? So you have the same technology helps you with your microscope, and you can turn it around and do telescopes. Well, they used it and they found the microscopic life. And so I think it took, 100 or something years to really figure out that was what was causing people to be sick.
Yes.
And so what I'm proposing is that it's the reverse, but what we're looking at now could be, or some sort of effects from the macroscopic world, meaning, that we're inside of a larger ecosystem and there's actually much larger macro effects that could be applied. If you imagine, like, if we were going to maybe interact with a certain microorganism, like a bacteria, we would make maybe kind of little bodies, right, to try and interact with them, code them with some sort of little programs that talk to the other little bacteria or little cells around there. And so if you're creating these kind of organisms down there, you're making billions of them, maybe some of them come out with, like, the esophagus isn't really fully formed,
Well, I'm comfortable with that idea. I think it would have upset a lot of people. Hitler, for example, would have probably been uncomfortable to think that he was actually more or less a microorganism. And then that would mean that perhaps Jesus had been miniaturized somehow. And in any case, I don't mean to make light of it. I think it's a fascinating idea. And I will tell you, I've read a book called Universe Within. Are you ever familiar with that? The surprising way the human brain models the universe. And it's I have to confess that I haven't read the whole book yet, but is a very carefully worked out book. It's a John Hunt publishing book, which they publish a fair number of pretty good science-related books, and the idea is that the brain is structured in a way that mirrors the large-scale structure of the universe.
Mm.
So it could be that this mirroring has something real about it, and that we could be looking at something very, very different from what we're assuming. The average assumption, the immediate assumption is, well, it must be aliens from another planet. And I find that assumption infinitely fascinating. I think a lot of people do. But I also have trouble with it. And, we're talking now about some of the trouble. It doesn't really work in a lot of ways. Like, for example, if you turn it around and say, well, what if we went to another planet? Well, first of all, if only a few people went to another planet, if everybody went, then it might be pretty chaotic. But if, say, only a group of scientists went, the following things would happen. They would, first of all, not reveal themselves. No anthropologist would agree to that, not for a moment, because we would want to observe them in situ as they were. Second, the biologists would say, well, in order to understand them, we've got to sample their biology. And we would land and probably anesthetize some of them, take some biological material like sexual material, maybe even create some in the lab from the sexual material we had taken in order to see how they ticked, especially if we didn't have any particular ethical reason not to. And we don't have any ethical reason not to do that to animals. We do that all the time. So if we went to another planet, wouldn't we consider them animals, or would there be an ethical level of our approach to them that would say, no, look, they have buildings and structures and writing, and look at all those colored lights. They're intelligent in some way, and therefore we will treat them with the same respect we treat ourselves. But maybe that wouldn't be our cultural response. It wouldn't be the cultural response of every culture on this planet right now. Certain cultures that have a different idea of the individual than we do in the West might be not necessarily so ready to make a decision like that. Now, what am I saying? I started out by saying, well, maybe they're not. Maybe this isn't aliens from another planet. Maybe it's something very strange and very different. But if you look at it like I just have, you come to a different conclusion. You come to the conclusion that it may be just that, because it might look just like it does to us if it was that. But then you get to the bodies. And unfortunately, the reality of the bodies isn't public. And the fact that they are so peculiar isn't known. But they almost look like something somebody built in order to make us think that they were physically real. And that takes us all the way around in a circle to where you started the question. And the fun thing about this is, if you work with it carefully, what you do is you go around in these big circles. And if you find if you're not going around in big circles, you're doing something wrong.
You don't end up back where you started, then you're not doing it
Exactly.
correctly.
You got to keep the question open, or it doesn't work. It does not work if you don't keep the question open. You can't draw conclusions yet.
Yeah, that on the interdimensional aspect, it's almost like, and from reading your books, it seems like it could almost be us. That's kind of the impression I get. There's an underlying tone in there that it could almost be yourself messing with you, or some element of that, our own consciousness. And if you look at all these breakthroughs that we're seeing, or almost the crisis in cosmology, they just found the big ring. They call it the big ring, a giant ring of galaxies that shouldn't exist. It sounds like they're finding really strong, compelling evidence of life on Venus, in the actual clouds of Venus. So
yeah,
basically, the only reason they haven't said there's life on Venus is because there can't be life somewhere else. Otherwise, all other indicators point to life on Venus. So if you mentioned the universe is related to the actual brain structure. I made a video actually over a year ago that relates to a paper that came out of Italy. So I'm curious, this book, I'll look it up after when this book was released, because there was a paper came out, I believe, in 2019 out of Italy, and it basically showed that the density of galaxies in the universe and the actual structure of it, so the way it's laid out, resembles and is statistically significant with the structure of the neurons in your brain. So the same density, the same number of nodes, right? Each neuron has like 5 different nodes. So they actually looked at the structure of the brain related on per neuron, how many nodes come in and how many nodes go out, and then the actual density of the galaxies. And they found statistically in this paper that it's the same, exactly what you're saying. Statistically, the structure and density of the brain is the same as the greater cosmos. And if we find out, yeah. And the final point is, if our assumption is that the fundamental world is the material world, the one that we're talking on right now, if that's your assumption, then everywhere you go, you'll end up back at the same place, right? If your assumption is the
we did that
material world is
already.
the bottom, yeah. But I think we'll find, or maybe we'll find that the actual, the consciousness realm, or whatever this realm, I think more than anyone else, maybe, the consciousness realm may be the fundamental. And so maybe if we can look from that angle, then we could see that there's many similarities, actually, like Donald Hoffman says. Maybe it's just a data structure. So just to see your thoughts on that.
Well, I
Okay.
would guess he was aware of the paper, maybe not when he was writing the book. And it covers essentially the same ground. What's so fascinating about this is that it also reflects very ancient wisdom. The emerald tablets of Hermes Trismegistus, as above, so below, are essentially about the idea that the individual reflects the greater universe. And I mean, couched in different terms. And if you read some of these people like Madame Blavatsky, whose material is I mean, it's reasonably absurd. I don't want to offend anyone, but in fact it is. But at the same time, there are places in it where she did deep, concentrated sort of inner looking and describes things that were later found to be molecules. She was seeing that deeply. And so what happens is, I think, when we try to look out at the world around us, we cannot help but looking inward in a certain way. There's a writer, you may have even had him on your show, Bernardo Kastrup. Bernardo Kastrup is an idealist.
Not yet, I wish, yeah.
But you haven't had Bernardo on? Well, you need to
I invited him. He was too busy when I invited him last time. I think he was just overtasked, but I've seen him going on
inviting him.
some other podcasts.
He's always too busy, and he's never answers emails quickly. I don't know him very well. I only have corresponded with him extremely briefly, but we have Jeffrey Kripal is a friend of his, and so Jeff wrote him a letter about 4 weeks ago, hoping to get a reply, and we haven't heard back yet. And he's a friend, so keep trying. Anyway, for those who don't know, Bernardo is an idealist, and he believes the universe is an idea. Now you'd think, well, that's stupid. We can measure the universe so easily. It's not an idea. But when you look at the truth of the situation, he cannot be discounted, because we only perceive what is given to us by our physical perceptual system, no matter what kind of instruments we may devise to see what kind of radiant effects in the universe. Nevertheless, we never perceive anything directly. It always comes through this thing. And so he's right. But of course, I can also prove
our dashboard.
Yeah,
does he call it the dashboard? Okay, yeah.
He might, I don't know, but he's quite right about
Donald
that.
Hoffman, yeah.
But his real point is we can't prove that the universe is physically there, and he's quite right about that. Of course, I can also easily what? I can easily show.
That was my argument for the circles. Yeah, for the circle that, like you mentioned, if you're not looking correct, or if you don't end up back in the same spot. But if we're only, that's, I guess my argument was from Bernardo Kastrup's viewpoint, right? If you assume the opposite, that it's a materialistic world, then if your answer lies outside, you'll always end up in a circle inside the materialistic world. You'll never get to the answer if it's in the
You
consciousness
can't.
realm.
Oh, you know, Gettier, that the philosopher in 1963 produced a little. It was actually a graduate paper. He was found out the week before his PhD conference that he owed a paper that hadn't been written, and frantically put a paper together that completely, without expecting this, he completely revolutionized modern philosophy. And by proving that we can't actually know anything for certain. There is no certainty. I'm not talking about quantum physics now. I'm talking about the level of macroscopic experience. I can explain very simply, as papers naturally being a paper written by a modern philosopher, it's appropriately abstruse, but it comes down to this: the cow problem. Farmer has a cow, which is, she's a Holstein, black and white, and he thinks she may be ill. So he takes her from the other cows and puts her in a separate field near his barn. The field is empty except for two features. There's a little hollow and there's a tree. If she wanders into the little hollow, he won't see her, but only for a short time because it's just a small hollow. So he's not concerned. He will keep a close eye on her, and he does that as he works on his tractors and whatnot, glancing into the field from time to time to see if she's all right, and she does appear to be all right. Then he concentrates a bit on his work, and during that period, a piece of black and white paper blows into the field and gets caught under the tree. She wanders into the hollow, and she's still all right. He glances into the field and sees the paper and concludes that, well, there she is under the tree. She's still all right. Now we get to the human condition. He is right and wrong at the same time. He's right. She is fine. He's wrong. He has not seen her. And we can't ever tell where we are in that paradox. No instrument can ever defeat that paradox, nor can the mind, nor can the senses. And that's why I
Oh,
say,
quite interesting.
yeah, I say to the people who are the alien people and the UFO people, keep it in question. My wife used to say a wonderful thing. She used to say, the human species is too young to have beliefs. What we need are good questions. And I think she was absolutely right. If we don't have good questions, we can't get anywhere, especially not with material as peculiar as what I write about.
I think a good example of that in this world or universe is if you try to describe anything in detail, what you find is you can never describe it without referencing something else. And I
Exactly.
think
You
that's the
can't.
problem. It doesn't matter what anything. Look, if you're trying to describe something, a person, place, or thing, a noun, something that exists in this universe, or yeah, a noun, or I guess even an action, anything really, you have to reference something else. So nothing, like you said, is standalone. So when you really go to find out what something actually is, you can't, because it's only related to something else. It's like you fall through the net.
You know, our very best minds have not been exposed to this conundrum of these bodies and the materials, let alone the close encounter narrative. And that's unfortunate because we haven't really thought about this yet. We haven't thought about it. I listen, the people on the inside it's a limited group of people, and they have limited capabilities, intellectual capabilities. The great geniuses of the world are not there. Stephen Hawking never got to know about this stuff. He never got to think about it, except in the very broadest terms. And he was quite right in thinking that if it's aliens, we should be very concerned about the vitality of our own cultures and the cohesion of our social structures. He's right about that. I think it's terribly unfortunate that this has happened, and it has happened for two reasons, I think, primarily. One reason is that it started with the Air Force, and it started with people like General Nathan Twining, who was converted to Catholicism right before the Roswell incident in 1946. He left the 15th Air Force, and when the war was over in Italy, and came to the United States and became head of Air Materiel Command. And He was also became a friend of Padre Pio, the levitating saint, became a Catholic at the same time. And then the next thing you know, he's got the Roswell incident on his hands. And what does he conclude? Presumably his confessor is Padre Pio or someone close to Padre Pio, and he concludes that they must be demons. Therefore, what do you do with that? You ignore them. You ignore demons. And that is one of the things that started the whole secrecy. The other thing was they couldn't figure out what the hell it was going on, and they just covered it all up because they didn't know. General Arthur Exon, who was a friend of one of my uncles, this is a family affair with me, by the way. I didn't know it at the time I wrote Communion, but later on, my uncle told me that he was at the Air Materiel Command attached there when the debris and biologicals were brought in from Roswell. And he introduced me to General Exon.
Is that it, Wright Patterson?
It was
Wright
Wright
Patterson?
It was the Wright Field then, but it's now Wright Patterson, yes. And
Wow.
he introduced me to General Exon, who was later commandant of Wright Patterson. But the general, it was, I believe he said he was he major or colonel? You know, he was a middle officer at the time, and he was also attached to Air Materiel. And he said to me, everyone from Truman on down knew that what we had was not of this world within 24 hours of our finding it. And from that day to this, we have been in a state of complete confusion about the whole thing. But the thing that nobody understands, everybody's screaming, oh, more disclosure, more disclosure. Congress has got to get to the bottom of it. When and if this is all out in the public space, there is going to be a horrifying discovery made. It will be that we still don't know what the hell it is. And that's why we got to have our best minds on it. Our very best minds have got to do this, and they're not getting the chance.
Do you think the demons are the same demons from the Bible?
Well, I don't recall the demons even being mentioned in the Bible. Unclean spirits are mentioned in the Bible plenty, but the word demon doesn't occur. Demons are something that were invented later by people with a desire to be entertained by fear, something I know a lot about because I used to write books that did that. I wrote horror novels.
Yeah, I read the New Testament. I've read probably a large part of the Old Testament, but you're right. New Testament, I don't remember any demon. And yeah.
No, there's no demons in the Old Testament.
No
The
Testament.
word is not there.
Yeah, where do we get demons?
Well, it comes from daemon, your inner being. And you know, if you ask a scholar of religion, the externalization of the previous religion's inner life and demonizing of it is a characteristic as we move from one religion to the other. The ancient Egyptians reverenced the spinal cord and thought of it as a serpent. It was in the Pyramid of Unas, the extraordinary hieroglyphics in the Pyramid of Unas describe the spine as a serpent of light. And what happens when Moses comes along, breaks with the previous religion, the serpent of light becomes a devil, and he's taken out of the body and put in a tree where guess who gets in trouble with him? Not the guy, of course. It's the girl. Because the guy mustn't get in trouble with him. It'll reduce his status.
Never.
So that's what we do. It's all a game. It's not real. There are no gods. I wrote a book called Jesus: A New Vision that shows conclusively that he was a human being, but also that extremely unusual things happened around him. And there's another book recently that I'm just reading now called They Flew by an Italian author. And it's a marvelous book about Catholic levitators. The Catholic Church is in the Baroque period, in the 15th and 16th and into the 17th centuries, was full of levitators, people who went into states of religious hysteria and came up off the ground. Now, you think, as I've thought initially, this is absolutely absurd. This is all fiction. These people never moved anywhere, and it's all a group hysteria. But then I met a man who worked as when he was a novice, a Dominican, I believe, novice. He was the assistant of the diocesan exorcist. And he reports that he was they went to a mental institution where there's a very troubled woman, and the family wanted an exorcist. The institution was not happy with this, but they couldn't refuse the family's request. So off they went to this place to exorcise this poor woman who was probably a paranoid schizophrenic. And in the room were the woman sitting in a wheelchair, the assistant, the exorcist, a psychiatrist, two nurses, and another assistant. In other words, 5 or 6 people, a number of them professionals. Even I suppose you could call the exorcist a professional of the sort. And in the middle of the exorcism, the woman rises up out of the wheelchair until she's halfway to the ceiling, still sitting there, apparently unaware of the fact that she's levitated out of the wheelchair. The exorcist says to the assistant, "Please push her back down into the chair." This man, whom I know, goes over, pushes her down into the chair, and she stays there. I said, "How did it feel?" He said, "Well, there was slight resistance. It was like pushing a balloon down into the chair." So I'd leave you with this question. Instead of just dismissing this as nonsense, I think it leads down another path entirely. We don't know what we are. We really don't. I mean, we don't know how the mind and the body and the physical world relate to each other, because we don't know what the mind is. We don't know what consciousness is. The hard problem is a really hard problem.
I think, yeah, especially if it doesn't exist, this other world, you just end up in a circle.
Well, if it does, but if it doesn't exist, are we thinking it into existence? In other words, you can't levitate. It's not possible. And yet he saw it happen. So what does that mean? It means that we don't know what we are. It gets right back to Edmund Getier's paradox. That paradox tells us that the question remains vital no matter how completely it seems to be answered. And if you're not comfortable with that, you really actually can't think in the modern world. You'll have the illusion of being able to think, but it's only an illusion. But then again, if you can think, that's probably an illusion too.
I often think that I question whether we have any free will, that maybe we're just an observer of this biological system. I mean, basically, if you went back in time, based on everything that you were, everything that the environment was at that time, you would have done the exact same thing. Meaning that
exactly. Why would we have free will? I don't see where the evidence for that actually is, because if you look carefully at the way the brain works, it assembles it prepares to respond to input stimuli slightly before they arrive, just about a quarter of a second or less before they arrive. That means to me that probably the block universe theory is correct, that we're not here inventing novel experience. We're here discovering. And there's a huge difference. Time is not real. It is the illusion that comes as we uncover more and more of an established reality. I wouldn't be at all surprised if that was not true. I play around lots with thought, and my experiences have been so strange, my life. And I don't even talk about the really strange stuff because there's no point in it. I don't even know how, but I do write poems about it. And I've written a poem called Thought Problems that's germane to this discussion. It's a few lines and I'll read it.
Yes, please.
I think I thought, or thought I thought, or had thought. There were questions about that too. Thought questions like, is thinking about thinking thought? Or is it a thought? Or was it? Then I saw the sun on the floor. I thought it was revealing dust, but it wasn't there. The thought crossed my mind as a cloud crossed the sky. I thought in the wind. So there you go.
That's amazing.
That kind of sums up my attitude toward thinking and reality.
I've been doing a meditation lately. I just released a video on my friend's channel. He's a good friend of mine, lives nearby, and he's just started a YouTube channel actually 2 years ago. And it just took that long to really till he was ready to publish himself on the video, online. I'm sure you know what that's like publishing online.
Oh God, I do it
You
every
probably
week. It's horrible.
you must be the most trolled person who's ever published. I think you're on the list.
Oh, I don't mind the trolls. I think they're fun. Unless they get on my website and annoy my website users, then they get thrown out instantly. We don't wait 1 second. There are no warnings. They're just gone. But on the YouTube channel,
what's interesting? Oh, sorry.
on the YouTube channel, it's a free for all.
Exactly. But learning from him, I had a couple thoughts that you mentioned there, because he's been doing hardcore meditation on his own for 15 years. And that's really the internal world. And what we worked on when we did the meditation just this last week is that you're not your thoughts. And if you notice, thoughts are always about something else, a different time. You kind of mentioned time there, but it's never about right now. Like if you're just thinking about how I feel or your body or your how something tastes, you're really in the moment. And I don't know if that really is a thought. That's more of an experience. But a thought is about something on a different time, is what he was saying. So that came to mind. And the other thing that came to mind was your ancient religion knowledge. It seems like they're all about the internal world. And as a meditator, one of his, I think it's Sadhguru was his name, Sadhguru. He's a famous YouTuber actually that meditates, and he talks about seeing in his own meditations, and they talk about it in Buddhism, seeing these other kind of beings. I think they called the Ghana. Maybe you know about them as well. But do you think these old religions can give us insight and knowledge of these religions? You mentioned is it Osiris? Was it Osiris? Was the ancient Egyptian, or was it Anus? Anyway, what do you think about knowledge of ancient religions? Could it give us insight into what the phenomenon maybe could be? Do you think that'll help us move forward?
I think that ancient religions are very useful tools in the exploration of consciousness because they represent what we saw about ourselves before we knew that we were looking at ourselves. And in other words, there was an innocence there. And that innocence brought forth these beings. I'll give you an example of what I mean, and also of how terribly ambiguous this all is. We used to have people up to our cabin, and those of you who don't know, I had a close encounter experience in December of 1985 when we were living in a little cabin in upstate New York, not a terribly isolated area, but it was fairly isolated. And went through all kinds of shenanigans trying to figure out what had happened to me because I'd been beaten up sufficiently to know that it was a physical experience. And that resulted in the book Communion. My wife wanted to know if we could conjure these beings that I had seen. And in other words, could we draw them into our physical reality? And so we decided to have groups of people who had had the experience and we believed had actually had it and were not engaged in some scam or having psychological issues, to the cabin and see if they would have multiple witness experiences. And it turned out to work quite well. One night, a very complex experience occurred. This was the situation. There was a filmmaker and his wife in the living room. In the hallway next to it, there were two bedrooms in the hallway. In the first bedroom was a lady called Raven Dana. In the second bedroom were two women, Lori Barnes and another lady. Their names are immaterial. They're in my books. And there was a low light camera looking down that corridor because, of course, as you may imagine, you can't see it, but this room's full of cameras as the whole house is. Because if there is physical evidence of this, I want it. And I've wanted it for years and I've never gotten it. Okay, so that's the situation. In the middle of the night, Raven Dana experiences, she's waked up by a non-human presence that's standing beside her bed and touches her arm and she has a brief interaction with it, whereupon she says to it, it asks her in her head, what can I do for you? And she says, you could go down that hall, because that would put it in front of the camera. So it disappears. A few minutes later, the two ladies in the other room see it too and have a similar experience with it. Then it disappears again. Later in the night, the filmmaker wakes up and is appalled to see a little man with a huge head standing beside the bed looking down at him. And of course, he thought it was all just utter nonsense. And suddenly, it's not. And when he experiences fear, and this is where we're getting to the old gods, the little man turns into the head of Horus, the hawk head. And the eye of Horus was the first thing that Raven Dana saw. It was hanging on the wall at the foot of her bed right before the being showed up. So you see how intricately involved this is, us in our inner life. And it's as if something from our inner life comes out into the world at times. And after all, this thing in here is only probably maybe not even 1,000,000 years old. And we've only been looking at it in any objective way for a few years. God only knows what it can actually do and is capable of. I mean, maybe Catholic religious hysterics were flying around Spain in the 17th century. Maybe Padre Pio did levitate. Maybe the person who went up in the air in the mental institution really did do that. I mean, you just don't know. So the bottom line is this: we are in a situation that we would rather not be in. We don't want to be in a situation where everything is a question. But if we don't get comfortable there, we're never going to be comfortable with ourselves. It's a rather prolix answer, and I apologize.
No, I thought it was very powerful. I can tell that you've just written so many words. Yeah, it's interesting. So have you written any books lately? What are you writing a book now?
I'm writing a book right now. I'm always writing a book. I've been writing
What's
a
it
book
about?
since I
Can
was
you
6 years old.
You write every day in the morning, or what's your
I write
regimen?
every day, and basically my day is I get up at 6:30, I exercise, have breakfast, write, or do an interview, depending on what I'm doing that day, and then I'll finish out the interview in the afternoon and write in the evening. I meditate, do this an exercise called the sensing exercise 4 times a day at 1 o'clock in the afternoon with a group of friends on Zoom. And anyone's by the way can join. Just if you're interested, write me at whitley@streamer.com. Then I do that again with them, usually at 7 o'clock in the evening, and then I do it at 11 o'clock at night, and then again at 3 o'clock in the morning, and that's my day.
Excellent. And what benefits do you get from the meditation, do you find?
Well, I've been doing this particular exercise for 60 years daily. It's an exercise that I learned from the works of G.I. Gurdjieff, the Armenian mystic who was popularized in a certain way by another Russian writer called P.D. Uspensky, who wrote a book about him in his techniques called In Search of the Miraculous. I find that what it does is it anchors the attention on the body and splits the attention between the body and the mind. So you gradually become able over time to be the master of your own attention instead of your attention constantly going out into the world to wherever it wants to be taken. You send it and it becomes your attention, not the attention that is part of you. And in Mr. Gurdjieff's system, you eventually wake up to a state called self-remembering. And these are very powerful states of consciousness that are quite ancient, I think. And I've been working at that. And so that's how my day works. And that's how the meditations work.
And I've heard from time to time that people may fear calling down or searching out with their consciousness. I've heard this. We did a live meditation a couple years ago with Carl the Crusher, and he was meditating online. It was intense. I've only done it once, and he was trying to reach out and send out his location into the universe. And we had a lot of people that were scared don't do that because you don't know what's going to be called down. And we actually didn't even say what he saw. He said he ended up on like a ship surrounded by grays, just like looking at him like, what's up?
Well,
That's what he said.
you
Yeah,
get what you ask for. You got to be careful. But
apparently.
I'm not careful at all. I mean, when I realized this was real, in despite of what had happened to me, I thought to myself, and I talked to Anne about it. I said, listen, we got to go for this. And she said, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you. And I said, well, listen, let's
But
do
it was
this.
after the sighting, right? Because I
This is
want to know, like,
after the whole
okay,
McGilla.
after, okay.
There was the
So are
close
you
encounter.
calling this on yourself,
Yeah, the close encounter experience, the abduction where I was raped and diagnosably raped badly. I mean, I was injured, and other injuries occurred, and I was very traumatized. You can't imagine, because to add insult to injury, I couldn't remember anything except these bizarre creatures around me that weren't human. And I had eventually come to the conclusion that, in fact, by all kinds of medical tests, thanks to my very kind doctor at the time, that I wasn't ill, either psychologically or physically. There was no explanation for it. And then there were the physical injuries. And what you concluded that something happened. I thought it was a crime. So I went to the Criminal Investigation Division in New York State. They did not have anything. They couldn't do anything. They came out and said, well, we don't even know where to look for evidence, and your descriptions of these people don't work because we don't have anything like that in our mug books. I went to a hypnotist, Dr. Donald Klein, who was a forensic hypnotist, not a UFO hypnotist. That was offered me by a man named Bud Hopkins, but I didn't want anything to do with that. I didn't believe that was real. And Dr. Klein had solved, at that point in his life, over 70 cases using forensic hypnosis. So people who say that hypnosis doesn't work and that it's too suggestible, in the hands of a real pro, it actually does. Because he could get people to remember the license numbers of cars that had hit them and things like that. Very substantive, factual successes. And
to find normal criminal investigations, yes?
Yeah, exactly. Part of normal criminal investigations. Yeah. And we both thought that that's what would happen, that I would be able to tell whether or not these people, enough about them to maybe understand who was behind these disguises, because that's what I thought I was dealing with. And the hypnosis occurred. It was just appalling. I was left completely gobsmacked because it appeared that there weren't disguises, that these were real. And so
Got to be surprised. This is back before. I mean, you basically literally wrote the book on abduction.
Right. I mean, this is
wasn't
before
a
any of that
mainstream
stuff was
thing,
out there. And so, but
so
my
terrible.
decision was this afterwards. I said this to Anne: we got to try to reconnect with these people. And I said, well, let's go out in the woods at night to the place where it happened, which I was pretty sure I recognized it. We'll just sit there and meditate, do the sensing exercise, and see if they come back. She says, that's a great idea. You go right ahead. I said, well, what about both of us? She said, well, we've got a little boy here in the bedroom, and he's my son, and that's my job. Your job is to go out there, Mr. Hunter, and do your hunting. And so that's what I did, night after night. And they did come back and re-entered my life, and they're still in it. It's been my life ever since.
They did.
I have no idea what they are. None.
Still not.
I don't know.
It's amazing.
I mean, I know all of the criteria that I need to fulfill to come to a conclusion about what they are. And I have not come to that any such conclusion, and I don't think anyone has. And the physical materials and the biologics are going to eventually be made public, and everyone's going to conclude that this is aliens from another planet. But they got to be there and do that. As I always say about this stuff, if you're looking at the materials are looking back at you. That's why I say to the people on the inside, you need to put one of the discs in the Smithsonian and let everybody have the experience of going near it and looking at it. That would be a real beginning of a new kind of human experience.
You think that's possible? I know you sent your book to them. You mentioned on your podcast many senators and congresspeople.
Yes, I
sent it. Did you hear any replies back, or are you optimistic in any?
Not a
None,
word.
not one.
Not a word. And I found that, they didn't even usually when you send something to someone in the political world, you get a form letter back saying, "Thank you for sending me the box of
Yeah.
candy, and I threw it out. Yours sincerely." But I got one form letter back.
Okay.
I didn't even get form letters. And that means that there's two possibilities. One is that they were intercepted in the mailroom and the senators never saw them, which is quite possible because the DOD is all over all of the infrastructure that supports Congress. And if someone saw that stuff, they might have said, well, let's just deep six this. Or the senators never just decided, no, this is a hot potato. We don't want to get involved with this guy. I am known in certain circles in the government as the Whitley problem.
It's pretty cool, actually.
It is cool. I think it's fine. I don't mind being
Yeah.
a Whitley problem. It's better than not being anything at all. And,
How do you define it? How would they define the
I'll
problem?
tell you exactly what the Whitley problem is. The Whitley problem is that Whitley draws attention to something that is very dangerous if it is attended to. It goes way back to the belief in demons. And there was a paper written by it's classified paper still, if it even still exists, but it was a theoretical paper written by one of the scientists who was first involved in this. And, I can't prove any of this. I have no documentation, but I'm just telling you things I believe to be true. John von Neumann, and he theorized that a more powerful vision of the universe, of reality, could literally overwhelm our vision and change the way the world we live in works. In other words, change it to work the way they think the world works, plunging us into a state of permanent non-meaning and a state of confusion which we could never escape from. And his idea was you must never open that door because that door is in the mind, and that door can never be closed. And what is the door? The door is in certain knowledge that these beings are real in some way. And I agree with Dr. von Neumann completely. And that's why I never, ever say anything beyond that this is a question. And I think that's where to leave it, because we have to perfect the question rather than jump to conclusions. And I wrote a story about this years ago called The Open Doors, about John von Neumann's last days and his thoughts as he faced the Grim Reaper. He was terrified of dying, poor man.
That was awesome. I remember being scared of dying, and I know maybe you just get older.
Yeah, well, I'm not scared of dying either. I'm fascinated. I'm
I
ready
do
to.
remember being scared of death, and I'm sure if I saw death, I would probably be scared of it.
When I was
And I would
younger, I
feel
was terrified
it's
of
more
dying.
regret for my family, but I do remember being scared of death, and I feel now that I'm not. I don't know when that changed, if it was like a gradual change, but it changed my outlook. I wonder if that would change many people's out. And this UAP problem actually changed my mind on that, because I was a total atheist. I read every one of Richard Dawkins' books, totally believed all that. And then started looking into UAPs. And once you realize that a way to limiting the solution set, you mentioned your brain, and we talked about that. We don't know what it does, but I think we know, at least we can agree that it's a neural network, and that's how it operates, at least our best understanding of it. And we're learning even more so now with AI, is that a neural network only knows what you put into it, right? It only knows what you put in front of a neural network. It doesn't know anything outside of what you put in. It just isn't even in there. I think that's humans, that's how we operate, and how in a larger system, again, I argue macrocosmic life, such as nations and states and tribes, I think it's just another larger organism or structure of whatever this is that we're calling life. I lost my train of thought there. Sorry.
Well, that's all right. I lose my train of thought all the time.
It's late here.
That always leads to another train of thought. But what you were talking about was the ambiguity of experience, and the fact that you spent a lot of time in your life as an atheist, and you brushed on the thought that the
Yes,
UAP
exactly.
issue
And then I went on.
changed you a bit. And I
Yeah.
wondered when
Do
you
you?
said that,
Yeah.
I thought what immediately came to my mind was, well, you can have an awareness of the non-physical side of being and still be a skeptic, which I am.
Mm.
I mean, that's exactly where I am. After my wife died, it turned out that for 9 months before she died, she had been carefully preparing a method of communication between us and executed it in such a way that I couldn't deny that it was real after she died. And I wrote a book about this called The Afterlife Revolution. It's utterly extraordinary what she did. And she was a very strange being. She was brilliant beyond anything I've ever known. I've never known anyone as smart. I've never known anyone as difficult either, because she was so sharp that she missed nothing. And I wouldn't be a writer if it wasn't for her, because she could read my books and she would write one of these novels and she would say, Whitley, this is just awful. I would say, what do you mean? Can
Perfect.
you expand on that? And she would say, well, my impression about 50 pages into it was, why do you even try? And yet then I read a sentence and it's so beautiful, it breaks my heart. We've got to get this together because you're not together. She did. I became a writer because of her. So anyway, she got a brain tumor in 2013 and was progressing slowly. And in the January of 2015, she suddenly began to make me insist I memorize a poem of W.B. Yeats's called Song of the Wandering Aengus. And I sort of thought it was just a whim. And she said a few days later, well, have you memorized the poem? I said, no, and she just burst into tears. And so I did memorize the poem. And it contains this line, when white moths were on the wing and the moth-like stars were flickering out. It's a little longer than that, but I'm not going to spout poetry for the whole interview. That line became terribly important because after she passed away, the first thing that happened was friends began to call me and say, Whitley, I just heard Anne in my ear tell me to call you. And it would always happen when I was thinking, do you still exist in any way whatsoever? Then I remembered years before, she had come out of her office when working on the letters and said, Whitley, this has something to do with what we call death. And the dead would often show up at the cabin along with the little gray people. We decided then that we would make a pact that the one who died first would come back, if possible, not to the other one, but to friends. I had forgotten about this pact in my grief and the struggle with her years of infirmity and slow dying. And then I suddenly recalled it after about 2 weeks of these calls. And I thought, my God, she's, it's the pact. I can't believe it. And then
You'd have to be shocked.
these white moths began flying back and forth in front of the cameras in the house. And someone said to me, that isn't a normal moth, some psychic. And I thought, how stupid. Of course, it's a normal moth. But then I looked for the moths and there were no moths. And then the moth when I would talk about the white moth and speculate about what may be going on, it would happen. I was with my son down in San Diego on Christmas in 2015 after she had passed away. And I said to him, that white moth keeps appearing on the cameras when I'm not at home, when I'm talking about Anne. Wouldn't it be a great Christmas present if that happened now? It happened then, immediately. And then I knew whatever is going on, whether it's Anne or not, something from somewhere was doing this. Then I remembered Anne's favorite short story of mine is about an old woman discovering that she's dead, and it's called The White Moths. But does that mean I believe in God and all of the old stories? Not at all. It means that I don't think we are entirely a physical presence. And I would assume that whatever others are here are more proficient in that area. And that's why we have all of these spiritual experiences. But does it mean that there was a God? It only means what it means. There is a presence, there's something in nature that we have not yet detected. And that should be no surprise. We hadn't detected radio in 1850. We hadn't detected, we in fact fought the idea of meteors for a long time before we finally admitted that they were there. We've only recently detected the true size of the universe. What's his name?
Right,
Lord Kelvin in 1898 wrote a perfectly beautiful and convincing paper full of mathematics showing that heavier than air flight was impossible. So, here we are on this wonderful journey. It's such an exciting place to be. I love being on the journey, and I love the fact that I've ended up in the middle of some of the best of all questions.
Well, that's excellent, Whitley. Thanks so much for your time. It sounds like you're optimistic. The impression I get is, like you just said there, you love being in this experience, and I love it as well. I truly love it, and I feel so blessed, And like you, I don't know if there's a God or anything. You see in the NDEs, they talk about the source. That we're all. It's really us that maybe we're looking at Bernardo Castro's kind of idealistic view of the world. But yeah, what do you think this year? Do you think we'll have any progress? Do you think there's any good chance or possible chance of a disclosure that is positive and
well, what would
optimistic?
it be?
The spaceship. Do you think they could wheel the spaceship and biologics out this week? Or sorry, this year?
Well, I have to say that there are reasons that they're probably not going to do that. And there are complex reasons, and we're at the end of the interview. There's no point in going into it. I could go into it in great detail, but no, I don't think it will happen that way. It may happen because, what's here definitely has a sense of humor, heavy on the irony, and a bit more sardonic than one would like, but there, nevertheless. I think that it's more possible that at some point there's going to be a convergence between the decline in the viability of the planetary environment and our awareness of this presence being, in some sense, part of the universe outside and in some sense part of us. Of course, I think to myself, the ideal thing would be if they did land on the White House lawn. And it fits certainly the sense of humor of the little gray people. So maybe that's how it'll happen. Who knows? But I don't think the bureaucracy has the ability structurally to do this magic moment of disclosure. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Okay, well, let's hope you're wrong, or at least it comes out through another method. We're doing a UAPSociety. We have a video contest. So anyone that's watching, or any of your viewers, even if they have videos, because I'm sure you get videos of UAPs, at least.
I've got two of the best videos ever made. I'll send them to you.
Oh, excellent. And this is how you do it, Whitley. I'd love it for you to enter the contest. You just put on YouTube, and in the title, you put hashtag UAP Society Contest. And then we can find it. It's automatically entered. Yeah, and then we'll watch it, and we'll vote on it. That'd be awesome.
Great. Excellent. I'll do it.
Excellent. Yeah, so thanks everyone else for watching. Please like the video. Please check out Whitley Strieber's podcast. Where else, and your books, where else can they find you, Whitley?
Well, my podcast, you can find me on YouTube, and it's all in all the podcast apps. It's called Dreamland. This is the 25th year of Dreamland. I've been doing it virtually every week for 25 years. And let's see, this week we have Peter Levenda. We just had Jim Semivan, and that's the sort of people we have a lot on. And on my website is unknowncountry.com. My books are available on Amazon. You can get them in Communion and all the other books. And the most recent ones, New World, Jesus, a New Vision, Them, Communion, and Afterlife Revolution, are all also read by me on Audible and audio, and they're very popular. People like that a lot.
Okay, excellent. All right. Have a great day, everyone, and take care. Peace.